Departure from Soerabaja, February 28th. Throughout the day, amidst the continuing air raids by the Japanese, little by little, survivors of the Battle of the Java Sea made their way into the naval base at Soerabaja. With them came news of the magnitude of the catastrophe that had taken place the previous evening. Sometime around noon, the destroyer Encounter came in, having hauled in as many survivors of the Courtenaire as she possibly could. Much to the delight of the U.S. sailors, one of those survivors was the Courtenaire's skipper Commander Cruiser Crows. Back in the early days of the American presence in Java, Crows, almost alone among the Dutch naval officers, had been welcoming to the Americans. They remembered it even now, and did everything in their power to repay his hospitality. Also creeping in was a Dutch patrol boat. She had just rendezvoused with the U.S. submarine S-38 to transfer 54 British survivors of the destroyer Electra that the submarine had fished out of the water. Then came another, bringing in U.S. Navy signalman Marvin Edward Scholer, who had survived the sinking of the De Ruyter. His communications mate, Otto Kolb, had not. U.S. submarine S-37, badly damaged by depth charging, had come across a boatload of the Dutch cruiser's survivors. Unable to take them all on board, she just took the American survivors, causing some consternation among the Dutch. S-37 did leave them with 5 days' provisions and towed them to within sight of the Java coast. At the other end of the spectrum was the grim task of burial of the war dead. During the afternoon, with the full cooperation of the Dutch, Captain Gordon led a detail to bury the Exeter's dead at the European cemetery of Kembang Koning. Commander Crows, leading a Dutch detail to pay honours to a wounded Courtenaire sailor who had died on board the Encounter, thought it sadly symbolic. It was all very tragic, the impressive ceremony, the beautiful uniforms, the immobile faces, and as background the lost cause of the Allies in the Indies. As if to emphasise the lost cause, a little after 2 p.m. came 12 Betty bombers out of Makassar city to bomb the port area, escorted by 12 Zeros of the Tainan Air Group, including the Japanese ace Sakai Saburo. Java Air Command scrambled 4 Dutch Buffaloes and a dozen P-40s of the 17th Pursuit Squadron out of Ngoro. But the worn-out Warhawks could not reach the bombers, and the dejected Americans turned back. The Dutch Brewsters aggressively tried to defend Soerabaja, but it was no contest. Mystified by the lack of caution of the Dutch pilots, Sakai shot down 1 Buffalo. A squadron mate shot down 1 more. The Bettys went about their task unmolested, although the Exeter's 4-inch high-angle anti-aircraft guns managed to keep them somewhat at bay, but not enough to protect the hard-luck Dutch destroyer Bankert. Sitting in dry dock to repair the damage to her stern from the near miss on February 24th, Bankert now took another near miss that added more damage to her stern. There was no way the destroyer could be repaired before the Japanese came. The Allied ships obviously could not stay in Soerabaja much longer. Java Air Command tried to strike back as best they could. In the morning they sent 3 B-17s against the eastern convoy. That evening they sent 8 wildebeests and 1 albacore, then a second attack by those same albacores, followed by 6 B-17s and 1 LB-30. These pitifully small attacks did little, if any, damage and achieved nothing. The bombers' airbase at Madioen would be evacuated that night. As the afternoon dragged on, the frustration of the British and American sailors grew as they waited for instructions from Ban Doeng. Here they were, enduring yet more Japanese bombs, while their superiors, Admiral Glassford, Admiral Palliser, and especially Admiral Helfrich, safely ensconced in the mountains, dithered in deciding their fate. Finally, the tension got too much for Commander Binford. He telephoned Glassford's office. "We sent you a signal," said the voice on the other end of the line. "We told you to go to Australia, but the Pope has to wait and help escort the Exeter." "If she does, she's a goner," warned Binford, knowing that the crippled cruiser had little chance of escaping. The response contained no hint of sympathy. "That's too bad. Pope wasn't in the battle and still has her torpedoes. She has to escort Exeter." During this time, Admiral Helfrich, Admiral Palliser, and Admiral Glassford had been in discussions about what to do with the remaining ABDA ships. But for the most part, Helfrich did not listen to his British and American subordinates. Palliser and Glassford believed that Java could not be saved. Helfrich insisted on continuing the fight. The resulting orders left absolutely no one happy, except perhaps Helfrich. Commander Binford had received permission to take his destroyers John D. Edwards, Alden, John D. Ford, and Paul Jones to Australia for rearming. At least they could now leave. They were told to leave Soerabaja through the Oostervaar water and go into the Madoera Strait. From there to take the Bali Strait between Java and Bali to the Indian Ocean and Australia. At 5 p.m. the John D. Edwards and Alden got underway, heading for the Oostervaar water. Shortly thereafter the John D. Ford headed for the Westervaar water, and the Paul Jones headed for the Oostervaar water. As they passed the Exeter, the crews on deck gave the British cruiser a loud cheer for her courage and heroism the previous day, and for encouragement in the extreme trial that awaited her. The trials of war can bind anyone together, even people from different countries, from different navies, and from different traditions, and the US Navy appreciated the work done under extreme duress by their British counterparts. The Ford then turned around and joined her cohorts heading out through Soerabaja's east exit into the Madoera Strait. This unusual method of leaving had been done knowing they were being watched by Japanese float planes, in the hopes of convincing them that the US destroyers were merely sounding the route for the Exeter to leave. At 5 p.m., as the destroyers of US Destroyer Division 58 were getting underway, additional orders came in from Admiral Helfrich. The destroyers Encounter, Pope, and Witte de With were to report to the Exeter for duty. Captain Gordon flashed a message to the destroyer captains to board the Exeter for a conference. At 5:20 p.m., the skippers of the destroyers who would be escorting his crippled command arrived. Commander St. John Morgan of the Encounter, Lieutenant Commander Welford C. Blinn of the Pope, and Commander Chotel of the Witte de With. Now Captain Gordon would give them the appalling plan from Ban Doeng, as it was relayed to him by Commodore Collins. The Exeter was too badly damaged to continue with combat operations, so Admiral Helfrich had authorized her to go to Colombo, Ceylon, for repairs. There was nothing unreasonable in that, until Captain Gordon relayed to the destroyer skippers just how they were to get from Soerabaja to Colombo. Rear Admiral A.F.E. Palliser, R.N., of Staff has determined that the Exeter's best chance of escape, considering intelligence reports, Exeter's material casualties, and her deep draft, is to pass to the east of WWII Island, head northwest then west for a daylight run to Soenda Strait, where an after-dark transit could be made into the Indian Ocean. The Japanese have landed to the west of us, and we must skirt their supporting naval units. To give a short background, the Exeter had a severe problem getting out of the rapidly closing trap in the Java Sea. There were 3 routes she could use to get into the Indian Ocean. To the immediate east of Soerabaja between Java and Bali was the Bali Strait. On the other side of Bali was the Lombok Strait. Far to the west, at the other end of Java, was the Soenda Strait. The Bali Strait had been ruled out because it was believed to be too shallow for the Exeter. The Lombok Strait was considered and was advocated by Admiral Glassford. It was the shortest and fastest route out of the Java Sea for the Exeter and her cohorts, and would give them much more room to manoeuvre. But the route did have the disadvantage of passing through the strait in broad daylight within visual range of the Japanese-held Denpasar airfield, and lying within the range of the ever-menacing airbase at Kendari II. Admiral Palliser pushed the option of the Soenda Strait. It required the Exeter and her escorting destroyers to loiter for an entire day just off the southern coast of Borneo in the Java Sea, an area now infested with enemy ships and under skies continually patrolled by the enemy, until they could make a night dash through the strait, hopefully evading the Japanese units that would control the strait by that time, and into the Indian Ocean. It is very difficult to understand why the Soenda Strait route was chosen over the Lombok Strait route. To be sure, the Soenda Strait had 2, maybe 3 potential advantages. The first was that the Japanese might be so busy with their advance that they would not look behind them, which is where the Exeter group would be hiding, if one considers sailing in broad daylight in enemy-controlled seas under enemy-controlled skies hiding. That was a slim read at best. The other, apparently, was the Japanese fuel situation. By Admiral Palliser's calculations, the Japanese warships in the Java Sea would be running out of fuel, and with the landing operations completed by that time should be on their way to get their fuel bunkers refilled, or be so restricted in their movement by low fuel as to be willing to let the Abida fugitives go. A third possible advantage was this. The Japanese would not expect a senior officer to be so stupid as to try this route. The problem of the Exeter's route was carefully considered. So states the narrative of the Java Sea campaign produced by the US Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence. If it sounds defensive, that is because it is, and it should be. This route may have been carefully considered, but apparently it was carelessly decided, and would prove to be controversial post-war. The Exeter was believed to have a slim chance of escape in any case, but with this route that chance became none. Trying to force the Lombok Strait and get into the Indian Ocean, where she would have far more manoeuvring room, was the obvious and logical choice, one that, while hardly guaranteed, gave the Exeter, Encounter, Pope and Wittede with the best chance of escape. This was more a prayer than a plan. For all of Admiral Pallis's alleged mistakes in handling the air cover of Force Z, this route for the Exeter was a far greater error and hard to explain inasmuch as it seems to violate common sense. The reaction to this plan from the crews was not entirely supportive. Lieutenant John Michel described how these orders were received on the Pope. The immediate effect of this information on the officers of the Pope was to curse the Dutchman responsible for that order. The next things to be cursed were the torpedoes. Without them, we would have been ordered to proceed with our own destroyers out past Bali. The Black Hawk received her share of vituperation for having given us the torpedoes in the first place, and on general principles. That the order came from an Englishman and not a Dutchman did not gain it any better a reception on the Exeter. Our preference was for a run to the east, and so down into the ocean south of Java and the islands with a dash for Darwin or an Australian port, risking the mines and seeking more room to manoeuvre, the Exeter's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Twiss, would say. Captain Gordon thought, "It looked to me that we hadn't a hope in Hades of getting through." Captain Gordon was bound to obey his orders. He went over the specifics of their route and their formation. He also announced at least some encouraging news from his engineers. They would probably be able to get 2 more boilers online by about 11 p.m., giving the Exeter a total of 4 operating boilers, though just how much they could give would depend on power trial at sea. She had a potential to reach 24 knots. They would be leaving at 7 p.m. At this point, Captain Chotel of the WWII interrupted. Not knowing of this assignment sooner, I granted shore leave to my crew. It will be impossible to round them up in the time allowed, he said, adding, the dry dock was to be made available tomorrow. With the Japanese landing on Java mere hours away, with the trap of the Java Sea rapidly closing as the Emperor's ships moved to seal the exits, with time remaining to escape that trap now down to mere hours, and being docked in a bombed-out city, Captain Chotel had given his crew shore leave. Captain Gordon replied, "My orders are to leave tonight. Do the best you can in rounding up your crew, then follow at your best speed to catch up." Ultimately, the WWII was scheduled to leave at 9 p.m. She was given projected courses and speeds to allow her to catch up and meet the Exeter around midnight. At 7 p.m., under the cover of a beautiful tropical night, the Exeter led out the Pope and the Encounter through the winding west of our water out of Soerabaja for the final time. Perth and Houston move out February 28th. At Tanjung Priok, talk of what had gone wrong the day before had become rumours of what was to come for the cruisers Perth and Houston. These were happy rumours in some cases. Our spirits were high. "We thought we were going home," Houston Marine Private Lloyd Willey would later say. Anti-aircraft officer Lieutenant Leon Rogers thought, "Thank God we're going to get out of this Java Sea." Lieutenant Commander Richard Gingras, the Houston's chief engineer, was upbeat. "You know, I had no hope that we would ever get away from all this, but now I think we've got it made." Java was gone, as any sane person could see. Rumours abounded on the Houston that they were going back to the United States. Similar happy rumours were amok on the Perth. But amidst the happy rumours came some ominous portents. Sailors, whether military or merchant, can be a superstitious lot. On the Perth, the portrait of the Duchess of Kent, who had renamed the cruiser upon its entry into Australian service in 1939, had fallen from the wardroom bulkhead and crashed to the floor. Someone remembered they had 2 chaplains on board. As Perth historian Ronald McKee would write, 1 chaplain was bad enough, but 2 that was lethal. Someone on the Houston remembered their trip northward through the Soenda Strait into the Java Sea on February 23rd, when he had heard the sound of a gate clanging shut. The most worrying signs of all were from the cats. Red Lead, the Perth's feline mascot for over a year, tried 3 times to jump ship. Eventually, to keep her on board, she was clamped in irons a kerosene can with holes cut out for her paws. The Houston's cat tried desperately hard to escape as well. Cats seemed to be a theme on the Houston, where many of the crew worried that the Houston, like a cat, had lost 8 of her 9 lives, and that this last joust with fate would be too much. Did the cats know something? Whatever terror the cats felt were matched by the exasperation and disgust felt when Admiral Helfrich's orders for the Houston and Perth came down. Captain Waller and Captain Rooks were at the British Naval Liaison Office. They were told they would not be going to the United States or even Australia. Helfrich, stubborn and obtuse to the last, had ordered the 2 cruisers and the destroyer Evertson to leave Tanjong Priok as soon as they were ready, sail through the Soenda Strait and make for Cilacap. Rooks responded that Cilacap did not appear to be a very desirable destination. In breaking the news to Waller, Commodore Collins was almost apologetic, saying he had no choice. Admiral Glassford made it clear to Rooks that he disagreed with the orders and hoped they would be changed to send the cruisers to Fremantle, Australia, or Colombo, Ceylon. The 2 captains spent part of the afternoon talking aboard the Perth. The one piece of good news they got at the British Naval Liaison Office was that the Soenda Strait, the cruiser's only route of escape, was still open. The only information the Houston and Perth were given as to Japanese dispositions was that a group of cruisers and destroyers was escorting a large enemy convoy headed east about 50 miles northeast of Batavia. Otherwise, they were told, a Dutch reconnaissance aircraft had reported that as of 3 p.m. there was no Japanese force within 10 hours of the strait. Perhaps it was best that none of us knew the awful truth, as Walter Winslow wrote, but some did know. Captain Rooks had briefed his senior officers about Admiral Helfrich's new orders. They were less than supportive, with their common sense expressed by Senior Aviator Lieutenant Payne. My God, the war was over. There wasn't anything left to fight with. That was like going to your own funeral. Captain Rooks tried to lift everyone's spirits. We're getting out of the bottleneck. He informed them of the latest ABDA intelligence showing no Japanese force within 10 hours of the strait. Lieutenant Payne was unconvinced. I told Captain Rooks it was wrong. I had seen a Japanese cruiser 70 miles northeast of Batavia that afternoon. Also, the plane that came in just before I did had to come from somewhere, and it was a ship-based plane. The Perth and Houston were set to leave at 6:30 p.m. just after sunset. Just before they left, Australian Sub-Lieutenant Gavin Campbell, Captain Waller's secretary, handed the report on the Battle of the Java Sea that he had written in Waller's name to Commodore Collins. For him, that battle report was utter trauma. I had only a few hours to get it together from all heads of departments and then do it. I held back the Commodore's driver so that he could take the finished report before the ship sailed. Otherwise, as it happened, no one would have known what had occurred. Indeed, his was the only report by a senior officer of the combined striking force written contemporaneously with the Battle of the Java Sea. With that administrative detail completed, all they needed was a pilot to take them through the minefield. An hour later, when that pilot had not shown up, Captain Waller decided that trusting his navigators and charts to risk the minefield was preferable to waiting in this veritable trap for a pilot who might or might not arrive. The 2 cruisers got under way. As they were slowly moving towards the harbour entrance, Captain Waller noticed that the Dutch destroyer Evertson did not seem to be getting ready to move. He hailed her and asked why she was not getting under way. Evertson's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Walberg Marius de Vries, replied that he had no orders to do so. Waller strongly recommended that he get those orders and get the Evertson under way. De Vries responded that his boilers were not up, so he did not have engine power and could not do so for another hour. And so the Evertson, like the Witte de With, was left behind to catch up as best she could. Another example of the strange lack of urgency on the part of the Dutch. Cautiously, the Perth led the Houston through the minefield, trusting her charts, her navigators, and her navigators' memories to make up for the missing pilot. Eventually, they cleared the mines and raised speed to 22 knots, a speed dictated by considerations of their less than optimal fuel situation. As they left Tanjong Priok, Captain Waller received a report that at 4 p.m. air reconnaissance had spotted an enemy convoy of 10 transports escorted by 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers about 50 miles northeast of Batavia heading east. Waller remarked to his navigator, Lieutenant Commander J.A. Harper, that it looked as though the Japanese would land east of Batavia that night. Harper replied that it was unlikely, with a convoy to look after, that the Japanese escort would trouble Perth or Houston. Waller agreed. Once clear of the minefields, the hopes of the crews were dashed. On the bridge of the Perth, Captain Waller made the announcement over the cruiser's loudspeakers. "This is the captain speaking. We are sailing the Soenda Strait for Cilacap on the south coast of Java. Shortly, we will close up to the 2nd degree of readiness. Air reconnaissance reports that the strait is free of enemy shipping, but I have a report that a large enemy convoy is about 50 miles northeast of Batavia, moving east. I do not expect, however, to meet enemy forces." The disappointment was palpable. On the Perth, the captain's words left members of the crew restless and full of foreboding, full of unspoken, unpronounceable fears like whispers in the dark. Engineer Lieutenant Frank Gillan of the Perth had a sense that at sundown was a dividing line between the past and the future, and that somewhere a decision had been made affecting his life and the lives of them all. The crew of the Perth had never been to Cilacap, had never even heard of it, but the Houston sailors had had quite enough of that lousy dump. With that unpleasant duty done, Captain Waller simply lay on the deck. "Kick me if anything happens," he told the officer of the watch, and was soon fast asleep. Eccentric, utterly unpretentious, this Hector Waller Heck, as he was known to everybody, was a well-known, well-respected character, and dearly beloved by his men, who would follow him to hell if that was absolutely necessary. Perth historian Ronald McKee said of Waller, "He was, among other things, perhaps the greatest fighting captain the Royal Australian Navy has produced." On the Houston, Walter Winslow, a pilot without a plane, had no duty station at this time, so he was allowed to go back to his cabin to get some sleep. The cruiser was dark. The only lighting Winslow had to guide him to his cabin were beams of blue lights along the floor. On his desk sat a wooden head, a beautiful ornament from Bali that he had purchased on the cruiser's first visit to Soerabaja and had named Gus. He asked Gus, his silent friend, "We'll get through this okay, won't we, Gus?" Though he could see nothing in the dark, Winslow was certain that Gus had nodded, and soon he, like Captain Waller, was fast asleep, sleeping the sleep of one who had been stressed for so long, denied rest and relaxation for so long, that the fatigue had seeped into his skin and bones. Everyone on the Perth and Houston was in that very same predicament, simply saturated with exhaustion. But for those of the crew on duty, even mere sleep was a luxury they could not afford. They had a ship to watch and protect, but it is not a good thing to have helmsmen with tired eyes, gunners with tired eyes, lookouts with tired eyes, especially during the hours of darkness. It was why none of those tired eyes noticed in the night the small, dark, silent shape that had started following them. The Battle of Soenda Strait Abdecom had always been very good at gathering information. The is due in large part to the incredible work of Patrol Wing 10 and the Royal Netherlands Naval Air Service under extremely dangerous conditions, as well as the signals analysis that was becoming a staple of Allied intelligence work. But communications was another matter entirely. Whether it was not getting Admiral Dorman the critical information regarding the location of the Japanese convoy for 4 hours or not telling Commander Binford, the Evertson, or the WWII that they could leave, Abdecom had more than its share of instances where the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing. The consequences could be, and often were, fatal. On the morning of February 28th, Sergeant Jeff Dewey, an Australian pilot in the Royal Air Force's No. 84 Squadron, took off in his Bristol Blenheim bomber from the Kalijati airfield in western Java and headed west-northwest over the Java Sea. Dewey was a veteran pilot, having flown numerous anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic earlier in the war. His target that day was Palembang, whose airfields had become just as much of a bane to Batavia as Kendari's had for Soerabaja. The Royal Air Force, based in the Batavia area, had been trading blows with the Japanese Army Air Force's Palembang airfields, doing considerable damage and hindering Japanese aerial efforts to a degree. But the British were running out of aircraft, and the Japanese were not. At around noon, he and his observer spotted a massive convoy of transports stretching as far as they could see. In front of the convoy were 2 light cruisers, and no fewer than 6 destroyers in an arrowhead formation headed directly towards Java. Sergeant Dewey immediately recognized the importance of what he had just found. Breaking radio silence, he radioed a report of the ships, their position and course to Caligari, and received an acknowledgement. He then went on to complete his bombing mission over Palembang. On the way back to base, he sighted the same convoy again. He radioed his sighting once again. After landing at Caligari, he also verbally reported what he had seen. Dewey's report was the most recent information available. It showed that the Japanese Western invasion force was far closer to the Java coast than previously believed. They were not 10 hours away, they were only 4. Caligari forwarded at least 2 of Dewey's reports to Bandoeng. Combining Dewey's report with analysis of the Japanese radio signals, they assembled a picture of what was approaching the western coast of Java. 50 to 60 transports and support ships, the carrier Ryujo, 4 heavy cruisers of the 7th Cruiser Division, 3 light cruisers, one of which was the Notori, and numerous destroyers. Their course would put them off St. Nicolaus Point at about 11 p.m. However, as one well-respected Air Force history put it, on reporting the sighting, very little notice was apparently taken amid the confusion prevailing. Bandoeng did send out a warning of what was coming to the Netherlands East Indies Army. For some indiscernible reason, no one thought to tell the Dutch Admiral Helfrich or the remaining Allied naval units, such as the Houston and Perth, that the Japanese ships were coming close to Java and the landing was imminent. The warning took the form of a piece of paper on the desk of Major General Wijbrandus Schilling of the Netherlands East Indies Army's 1st Infantry Division in Batavia. Although Schilling's office was in the same building as that of Commodore Collins and the British Naval Liaison Office, he did not tell Collins about the report. The general did not know that the Perth and the Houston were in Batavia, nor did he know that they would be leaving for the Soenda Strait and Cilacap that night. Nor did Collins think to ask him. After all, why would the report not have been forwarded to Collins at the Naval Command in the first place? Captain Waller and the Perth, Captain Rooks and the Houston, and hundreds of Australian and American sailors were heading straight into the middle of the massive Japanese Western invasion force. 2 cruisers, one already damaged, both almost out of ammunition, against half of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and they had no idea. Battle of Soenda Strait, February 28th to March 1st. After a short nap, Captain Waller roused himself from the floor of Perth's bridge. It wasn't the Waldorf Astoria, or even his stateroom, but it had served well enough for a power nap and a quick if incomplete recharge of his batteries. He went to the back of the bridge to help himself to a cup of coffee. Faithfully following some 900 yards behind the Perth was the Houston, Captain Rooks on steady watch. Still further behind, and as yet unnoticed, was a shadow low on the water. As they had seen signs that they were closing in on the entrance to the Soenda Strait, the sailors on watch had allowed their hopes to build. First, off to starboard, came the lighthouse at Babi Island, off the northeastern side of Bantam Bay on the extreme northwest corner of Java. Their plan was to cross the mouth of Bantam Bay and make for St. Nicholas Point, marking the northern entrance to the Soenda Strait on the far western side of the bay. It wasn't quite the course they had been ordered to follow. Admiral Helfrich had wanted them to loop around further to the north and enter the strait nearer its western side near the coast of Sumatra. But this course was faster, with any increased risk of meeting the Japanese mitigated by the report that no Japanese were within 10 hours of the strait. Nevertheless, as they got closer to the exit, the danger increased as well. Bantam Bay gave a dark backdrop where enemy ships could hide at night undetected. So did Babi Island to starboard and Panjang Island at the mouth of the bay. They could hide a battleship out there and we'd never see it until attacked, said Houston Marine Walter Standish. Captain Waller ordered speed increased to 28 knots. As the hopes of the crews increased, their vigilance increased as well in this dangerous corner of Java. Their hopes rose a little higher when they saw the light of St. Nicolaus Point in the distance, now only some 5 miles away. Their escape, their salvation, had just come into view. But something else came into view as well. A dark, vague form near St. Nicolaus Point. "Ship, sir, bearing green 05, came the call from one of the Perth's lookouts. Captain Waller and the bridge crew took a look. They could barely make out the low silhouette off the starboard bow. It was probably one of the Allied patrol boats still on station. They had been warned to be on the lookout for these boats, still on duty, so as to avoid friendly fire casualties. "Very good. Make the challenge," came the order from Captain Waller. The Perth flashed the challenge on an Aldis lamp. Behind her, Captain Rooks and the bridge crew of the Houston watched the exchange with concern. This unidentified ship seemed to be moving very fast for a patrol boat. The unknown ship flashed back 2 green lights. The signalmen understood them to be Morse code for UB. This was not the Allied night recognition signal. Captain Waller could not have been pleased. A former signalman, he was famous for being a stickler for proper signalling and could get very testy if proper protocols were not followed. "Challenge again," Waller snapped, the turrets of the Houston astern training in on the unknown ship, as that unknown ship turned away, making smoke, showing its full silhouette, its full long silhouette, that unmistakable low silhouette with the raked funnels of a Japanese destroyer. Japanese destroyer. Action stations. Sound the rattles. The destroyer, Harukaze, sped into Bantam Bay, making smoke the entire way and launching a red flare. Forward turrets open fire. Behind the Perth, on the Houston, the clangs of general quarters brought the sleepy Lieutenant Walter Winslow out of bed. He staggered to the bridge, not fully awake, to be greeted with the blinding flash of the No. 2 turret firing. "We were desperately short of those 8-inch bricks," wrote Winslow, "and I knew they were not being wasted on mirages. Captain Rooks ordered star shells fired to see what they were dealing with, but the first salvo at 7,000 yards fell short. So did the second at 10,000 yard, and the third at 14,000 yard. Once again, American star shells were not nearly the equal of the Japanese illumination rounds. As the fugitive Allied cruisers passed Babi Island, they saw the precise reason why the Harukaze had been so quick to make smoke. The spectacle left them aghast. Flying Officer Alan McDonough caught the shock and awe of it. "There are 4 to starboard. There are 5 on our port side. By God, they're all round us." At the far western end of Bantam Bay were dozens of masts transports. Captain Waller and Captain Rooks had unwittingly stumbled into Admiral Ozawa's Western Invasion convoy. The convoy, consisting of 56 transports carrying the 16th Army, plus escorts, had left Cam Ranh Bay, Indochina, on February 18th. It had later split up. One group of transports had split off with Yura and the destroyers Satsuki, Minatsuki, Fumitsuki, and Nagatsuki to land at Merak in the Soenda Strait. Another, escorted by the light cruiser Sendai and the destroyers Amagiri, Asagiri, and Ugiri, had split off and headed east, away from Soenda Strait, to land at Eraton Wetan on the north coast of Java. It was the latter force that had been spotted by the Dutch PBY and reported to Captain Waller. But the rest, 27 transports, were here in Bantam Bay with their escorts. Bandoeng's analysis had been surprisingly accurate. There was the aircraft carrier Ryujo, fast becoming an American nemesis. With her was the seaplane tender Chiyoda. There was the 7th Cruiser Division, under the command of Rear Admiral Kurita Takeo, with the 4 heavy cruisers of the Mogami class, even bigger than the large cruisers the Perth and the Houston had faced 2 days ago. There was the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, 7 destroyers, Shiratsuitu, Shirakumo, Murakumo, Shirayuki, Hatsuyuki, Asakaze, and Ahikinami, with the light cruiser Notori, flagship of Rear Admiral Hara Kenzaburo, who was in overall command of the convoy. Seemingly, the combined fleet was taking the protection of this landing very, very seriously. The Ryujo and Chiyoda were well to the northwest in the Java Sea, with Admiral Kurita's flagship Kumano and sister ship Suzuya, and the destroyers Isunami, Shikinamni, and Uranami. The other half of the 7th Cruiser Division, the Mogami and Mikuma, were north of Panjang Island in the Java Sea. Admiral Hara was with the Notori and her destroyers north of St. Nicolaus Point. With the convoy in Bantam Bay were 2 destroyers, the Harukaze and the Hatakaze, and 4 minesweepers, creatively named W1, W2, W3, and W4, while one more destroyer, the Fubuki, was north and east of Bantam Bay near Babi Island. It was an overwhelming collection of warships when compared to the Perth and Houston. Although Japanese intelligence had lost track of the 2 cruisers after the Java Sea battle, float planes had sighted the 2 cruisers in Tanjong Priok, just east of Bantam Bay, throughout the day on February 28th. Yet any reports of the Perth and Houston in Batavia seemed to have vanished before reaching anyone in the Japanese fleet who could use them. Communications problems were not limited to Abdicom. Admiral Hara would later say that he was trying to lure the Perth and Houston to their destruction, using his flagship Notorious bait, and then spring the trap with the Mikuma and Mogami. But, aside from the admission that he had abdicated his responsibility for guarding the transports, his story smacks of a cover-up for what was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most inept performances of the war. For nothing about Admiral Hara's force this night suggests any sort of a plan, more like a sense of panic. A panic for which there was good reason. Despite the last known presence of the enemy cruisers Perth and Houston in Batavia, or at least the eastern Java Sea, the only Japanese warship between Batavia and Bantam Bay was the lone destroyer Fubuki. The only Japanese warships between Batavia and the convoy were 3 destroyers, the aforementioned Fubuki, Harukaze and Hatakaze, and the Perth and Houston had managed to get by the Fubuki, that low shadow that had been following the 2 cruisers, and were now between the majority of the Japanese warships and the transports those warships were supposed to be guarding. Admiral Hara's ships were not deployed to protect the convoy. They were deployed to catch Allied ships trying to escape into the Soenda Strait. Arrogance, overconfidence, sloppiness, all were manifesting themselves with increasing frequency in the Imperial Japanese Navy. This time, it would cost them. The Perth and Houston had slipped by the Fubuki by hugging the coast while the destroyer was at the northern end of her patrolling course, but they had not done so unnoticed. The only Japanese warship between Bantam Bay and the ABDA base at Batavia had sent out a warning, 2 mysterious ships entering the bay, and yet the Japanese were still not ready for them. They had wanted to catch escaping Allied ships, such as unarmed civilian craft or small patrol boats, but apparently not warships, especially not heavily armed cruisers or battleships, as the Fubuki had assumed them to be. Making smoke, the Harukaze had run away toward the transports, while her sister Hatakaze had run to the north seeking help from Admiral Hara's Natori group and from the 7th Cruiser Division. Even worse, the 7th's commander Admiral Kurita, showing that same instinct that would make him so famous in action in the Philippines some 30 months later, chose to hang his own flagship back and let the Mogami and Mikuma handle the intruders. It was into this careless, panicked mess that the Perth and Houston entered. If Admiral Dorman and the De Ruyter, the Exeter and the rest of the combined striking force had been with them, they might have been able to strike a major if ultimately meaningless victory against these helpless transports. But they were not. There was just the Perth and the Houston, battered, exhausted, and almost out of ammunition. As historian Samuel Eliot Morrison would state, although Houston and Perth were only trying to escape, they had accidentally fulfilled the long-felt desire of Hart and Helfrich, and an object that Dorman had given his life in seeking. They had run into an enemy amphibious force at its most vulnerable moment. But alas, they were so few, and the time was so late. Captain Waller and Captain Rooks likely never knew the composition of the forces against them, and only gradually realized that they were badly outnumbered and outgunned. The reconstructed log of the Houston would state, no number of enemy ever accurately known, but estimated about 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and about 35 transports. It looks like a bit of a trap, Waller was heard to say, but they would still try to escape. Fubuki, still trailing the cruisers, decided she needed to do something to stop the intruders, and decided to follow the apparent maxim of Japanese surface ships. When in doubt, launch torpedoes. At 11:14 p.m. she let loose with at least 9 Type 93 torpedoes before running away to the north under cover of a smokescreen. It was a bad bet. The cruisers were moving away from the destroyer, presenting a decreasing stern profile. The slim chance of a hit became none when Captain Waller on the Perth led the Houston on a long loop to starboard to unmask her forward turrets against the targets that were rapidly revealing themselves to the west. Houston had finally sighted the stalking destroyer, but with her aft turret out, she could do little except feel self-conscious. The Fubuki's torpedoes sped by their intended targets and headed for the mass of Japanese transports anchored at the other end of Bantam Bay. The Japanese had been poorly deployed to protect the transports, but Admiral Hara tried to recover by ordering all his warships to converge on the Perth and Houston. It made sense, but the execution was chaotic, destroyers arriving in ones and twos. The Houston's log would say, "Fight developed into a melee Houston guns engaged on all sides. Range never greater than 5,000 yards." The unrelated Commander Hara Tamichi of the destroyer Amatsukaze, not a participant in this battle, would describe Admiral Hara's ships as scrambled in confusion and chaos. The chaotic nature of the engagement off Bantam Bay continues to confound historians trying to piece together what happened. With so many Americans and Australians killed, so many US and Australian records lost, so frenzied a Japanese response, and so many Japanese who wanted to cover up the ineptitude of their performance, the Battle of Soenda Strait remains a puzzle missing several pieces. The precise sequence of events in this engagement will probably never be known. Destroyer Hatakazi opened gunfire on the two cruisers and was shortly thereafter joined by the Asakazi and the Harukazi, the latter turning back to the battle, some 2.5 miles east of St. Nicolaus Point. The Houston and Perth were now deluged with 5-inch shells from the destroyers, their searchlights sweeping across the water trying to pin down their elusive targets with a spiderweb of unwanted light, but the targets were doing some deluging of their own. The Harukazi, hit by both Houston and Perth, suffered minor damage to her bridge, engine room and rudder, with 3 crew dead and 15 wounded. At 11:26 p.m, Perth took a 5-inch shell in her forward funnel, rupturing a steam pipe. 6 minutes later, another shell hit the flag deck, but the damage was only superficial. Destroyer Shiratsuyu was charging in from the west. Behind her were the destroyers Shikinami and Murakumo, but the last two were still about 3.5 miles west of any action. Moving to hold the blocking position were the Notori, Hatsuyuki, Shirayuki, Hatakazi, Asakazi, and Harukazi. The Perth responded with her 6-inch main battery and 4-inch secondary guns, while the Houston roared with her 6 functioning 8-inch main guns and her 5-inch secondary. At 11:30 p.m, Captain Waller turned the Perth to the south. Upon nearing Panjang Island 8 minutes later, he looped back to the northeast in a dance to avoid the shells coming her way. The Houston followed, as she would throughout the battle. Surrounded by so many targets, Captain Waller decided to allow his turrets to go to local control and fire at any available targets they chose. He also ordered the Perth's torpedoes launched. The Houston's Captain Rooks tried going to local control as well, only to find that the cruiser's dance to avoid incoming fire made it impossible to target, so targeting was switched back to the main battery director. A rain of shells fell around the cruisers. Nothing was hitting yet, but they soon would be facing far deadlier munitions than the small 5-inch shells of the destroyers. For, like the Fubuki, Admiral Hara too was following the maxim of when in doubt, fire torpedoes. At 11:40 p.m, 2 of his destroyers, Hatsuyuki and Shirayuki, launched 9 torpedoes each at a range of 4,000 yards. They missed. At 11:43, Asakazi launched 6 torpedoes, also from about 4,000 yards. They too missed. 1 minute later, Hara's flagship Notori made her dramatic entrance with 29 rounds of gunfire and 4 torpedoes launched at the Perth. They too missed. Walter Winslow would later swear that he saw 2 torpedoes, exactly whose is unclear, coming directly at the Houston, but instead of hitting, they passed underneath. If this is true, the torpedoes were set to run too deep, perhaps a reflection of the Fubuki's initial belief that the Allied ships were battleships instead of cruisers. The Notori turned away to the north under a smokescreen. Hara ordered the destroyers to form up on his flagship and to reload their torpedo tubes. But Admiral Hara's trump card in this particular game was about to arrive. The Japanese heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma of the 2nd Section of the 7th Cruiser Division, 2 overstrength treaty violations now with 10 8-inch guns each, a dozen torpedo tubes and magazines stocked full of ammunition. Screened by the lone destroyer Shikinami, they made their fashionably late entrance from the north at around 11:46 p.m. and promptly launched floatplanes. Mikuma's skipper, Captain Sakayama Shakao, who was commanding this half of the 7th Cruiser Division, decided that their first move would be to a course parallel to that of the Allied fugitives, heading northeast, while firing full broadsides with their 8-inch guns. 1 shell penetrated the Perth's hull near the waterline and started flooding. At 11:49 p.m. they launched 6 torpedoes aimed at the Perth from their starboard tubes. They missed. Before the 2 speeding Japanese cruisers could do much else, they found that Babi Island was in their immediate path, and they had to do a hard port turn to avoid grounding on the tiny island. Once that near embarrassment was avoided, the 7th Cruiser Division, using searchlights to pin their targets, opened fire on the Houston. The galloping ghost of the Java coast took a hit on the forecastle that set the forward paint locker on fire, giving the Japanese a point of aim until it was extinguished seemingly an eternity later. Somehow continuing to find 8-inch ammunition in the darkest reaches of her nearly empty magazines, the Houston gamely returned fire. She was rewarded with a near miss on the Mikuma that at 11:55 p.m. tripped the Japanese cruiser's circuit breakers, knocking her searchlights and main battery offline for about 5 minutes. With their bigger cruiser brethren now at hand, the Japanese destroyers became bolder and bolder, although not necessarily smarter. The Allied crews got some entertainment value from the Japanese ships, unable to pin the Perth or Houston with their searchlights, firing at each other. In one instance, the Japanese actually turned their searchlights on each other, illuminating their own ships for the Allied gunners. Destroyer Shikinami, screening the 7th Cruiser Division, took a battering on the port side from Allied guns and damage to her propeller from a near miss that reduced her speed to 24 knots. Destroyer Harukaze suffered damage to her rudder, while Shirayuki took a 6-inch hit from the Perth on her bridge, killing 1 and wounding 11. 49. The waters just outside Bantam Bay were a scene of pandemonium, but within that chaos, the Perth and the Houston were now surrounded. There would be no escape. The lack of ammunition on the Allied cruisers was now becoming desperate. At around midnight, Captain Waller was informed that the Perth's 6-inch ammunition was almost gone, and they were reduced to using practice rounds. He responded with, "Very good." Hector Waller, a veteran officer who had served with distinction in the Mediterranean as skipper of the destroyer HMAS Stuart, spent the night calmly and quietly issuing orders in the midst of this maelstrom. The secondary guns were also out of ammunition, now firing star shells and practice rounds. When those rounds were almost gone, one of the sailors asked what to do next. An older man suggested they raid the potato locker. Waller decided to make one last attempt to force their way past St. Nicolaus Point into Soenda Strait. He began a looping port turn back to the southwest at full speed. His objective would be Topper's Island, in view just beyond St. Nicholas Point at the northern end of the strait. Captain Rooks and the Houston, as always, followed. But there were too many ships arrayed against them. Too many ships even for the Japanese, perhaps, who were acting more like a circular firing squad than a noose to be squeezed tight to win a battle that by rights should not have been even this close. More Japanese torpedoes were launched, heedless of the fact that they were surrounding the Allied fugitives. At 11:57 p.m. the Mogami, now north-northwest of Panjang Island, launched 6 torpedoes from her portside tubes at the Houston to the south, at a range of about 10,000 yards. They missed and went on bubbling towards the mass of Japanese transports anchored to the south in Bantam Bay. Off in Bantam Bay, the commander of the Japanese 16th Army, General Inamura Hitoshi, was in the 8,160-ton modified transport Ryujo Maru. Earlier, one of his aides had heaved a sigh of disappointment to think that this landing operation was to be made without firing a single rifle or gun or without bloodshed. The arrogant aide's wishes probably changed when, as he was working to unload the second wave of Imperial Japanese Army troops, gunfire erupted offshore. On the Ryujo Maru, the facial expression of the soldiers changed to anxiety, and General Inamura watched the naval battle drift closer and closer to his transports with increasing annoyance. That annoyance turned to something worse when, at 12:05 a.m., the Ryujo Maru suffered an underwater explosion that tossed the general off the ship and into the warm waters of Bantam Bay. The thin-skinned Ryujo Maru had been hit by a torpedo. Explosions from torpedoes also rocked the transports Sakura Maru, Horai Maru, and Tatsuno Maru. They all sank in the shallow waters of Bantam Bay. General Inamura's aide remembered tanks and automobiles and freight which had been loaded on the deck fell into the water beside us with a dreadful sound. Tons of army equipment was destroyed, and hundreds of troops drowned. Precisely whose torpedoes struck the transports has never been conclusively determined. The only thing on which naval historians agree is that the torpedoes did not come from the Perth, or obviously the Houston. The Japanese themselves seem to think the torpedoes had come from the Fubuki, fired at the beginning of this engagement from the other eastern end of Bantam Bay. But a Japanese investigation could not determine who fired the torpedoes. Over the years, others have claimed that the cruiser Mikuma was responsible with a launch whose exact time is unclear. Given the timing of the explosions on the transports, the spread launched from the Mogami was most likely responsible. General Inamura believed the Houston was responsible, which in a manner of speaking she was. The Imperial Japanese Navy was all too happy to accept that version of events to cover up their own incompetence. The Mogami was not alone in launching torpedoes at will. At 11:56 p.m., the Harukaze fired 5 torpedoes, followed a minute later by 6 from her squadron mate Hatakaze. Shirakumo and Murakumo, coming from the west, each launched 9 torpedoes at midnight. Admiral Hara would later say that his ships experienced more than a few near misses from the 7th Cruiser Division's torpedoes, saying, "We felt very much in danger." The unrelated Commander Hara would relate the story of how the Japanese spent almost as much time avoiding their own torpedoes as they did firing at the Allied ships. The Perth, now reduced to firing star shells, and the Houston did not take this new harassment lying down. The destroyer Shirakumo was hit and damaged by the Houston, and more shells ripped into the Harukaze, killing 3 and wounding 5 men. At 12:07 a.m., the minesweeper W2 was hit, capsized and sank, possibly struck by one of the Mogami's torpedoes. The destroyer's searchlights were now finding the Allied cruisers. On the decks of the Perth and the Houston, it now felt like they were performing on a stage, stars of a show in which they wanted no part, but were giving virtuoso performances nonetheless. Now began a somewhat bizarre game. Waller gave orders to shoot out the searchlights. "For God's sake, shoot that bloody light out," was one of Waller's few heated exclamations during this entire engagement, and the Australian and American sailors working their machine guns proved fairly proficient at it. The Japanese responded with one destroyer having the cruisers in her searchlight, then snapping it off before she could be targeted, only to have another searchlight from someone else pin the fugitives. The destroyer's searchlights served to illuminate the Houston and Perth for the guns of the Mikuma and Mogami, hiding in the darkness somewhere behind the glare of the lights. Everywhere across the sky, Japanese flares and illumination rounds floated down like slow-falling meteors. As the destroyers came closer and closer, the Houston opened up with her 1.1-inch pom-poms and .50 cal machine guns. There is no adjective superlative enough to describe the performance of the Perth and the Houston in this, the last hour of their lives and the lives of Hector Waller, Albert Rooks, and a good portion of their crews. In their last stand, dead tired, surrounded, almost out of ammunition, chances of escape gone, they roared in defiance at the Japanese aggressors, firing every gun they had with every piece of ammunition they had, holding on for as long as they could. Somewhere, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans from Thermopylae must have looked on with approval, but there were just too many torpedoes. The Perth had just settled on her new course, still trying to make Topper's Island, when at 12:05 a.m. she was hit by a torpedo, probably from Harukaze or perhaps the Hatakaze, on the starboard side between the forward engine room and boiler room A. The Perth suddenly lost speed and became sluggish to the helm. With the flooding caused by the earlier shell hit near the waterline, the torpedo hit seems to have been particularly bad, and Captain Waller knew it. "Christ, that's torn it. Prepare to abandon ship." "Abandon ship, sir?" responded the gunnery officer. Waller shook his head. "Number, just prepare for it." The skipper was getting very discouraging reports of damage, to which he always responded very good to these pieces of news that were anything but. A few minutes later, 2 more torpedoes hit, probably from Shirakumo and Murakumo. One hit the starboard side near the forward magazine for A turret. Seawater and oil were splashed over the bridge, knocking down a number of men, including Captain Waller. Picking himself up off the deck, he ordered the crew to abandon ship. As the crew was evacuating, the 3rd torpedo hit, again on the starboard side, this time aft under the X turret. The senior officers on the bridge tried to get Captain Waller to leave, but the skipper refused. He remained with his hands clamped to the bridge railing, looking over the forward 6-inch turrets, now silent forever. He ordered the crew off the bridge and was never seen again. It was a grave loss to the Royal Australian Navy to lose such a fine commanding officer. Commodore Collins would later write, "Waller was a fine fighting sailor, a tower of strength and beloved by all." The loss of Perth, her fine captain, and her tried and true company was a sad blow to the Ran. But those who survived to be treated to the hell of a Japanese prisoner of war camp might have wondered if Waller had the right idea. The Japanese now closed in on the helpless Perth, still staggering her way forward as she settled lower and lower in the water, and with the cruiser pinned by multiple searchlights, blasted her with gunfire of pitiless efficiency. A fourth torpedo, from whom is unknown, stuck the cruiser on her port side, but it was superfluous. With her Australian ensign illuminated by the searchlights, the Perth was still moving, being driven by her only remaining functioning propeller. As her survivors would say, she did not sink, but instead she steamed out into the deep, some 9.5 miles north-northeast of St. Nicholas Point, at 12:25 a.m. on March 1st, 1942. Of the 686 souls aboard the Perth that night, 351 were lost, including Captain Hector MacDonald Laws Waller. Another 106 died in the hospitality of Japanese prisoner of war camps. The crew of the Houston watched the death of their cohort with sadness and anger. They were next, and they were alone. Captain Rooks gave up the idea of forcing his way to Topper's Island and turned around to make the Japanese pay. When Captain Rooks realized that the Perth was finished and escape was impossible, he turned the Houston back toward the transports, determined to sell his ship dearly, wrote Lieutenant Winslow. She fought on with even more ferocity. She was now caught in the glare of 3 searchlights, with the Houston using her 8-inch, 5-inch pom-poms and .50 cal machine guns against the Japanese searchlights. One of her Marines somehow managed to shoot out a Japanese searchlight with a rifle. At 12:20 a.m., Captain Sakayama had the Mikuma and Mogami maneuver to again adopt a parallel course to the Houston and began another exchange of gunfire, in which the Houston was severely punished. She received a serious hit, believed to be from an 8-inch shell, though some believe it was a torpedo, in the aft engine room. A second full salvo went through the wardroom. The hit ruptured steam lines and killed everyone inside. The cruiser's speed was cut to 23 knots. Another shell hit the number. 2 turret in the faceplate, just as powder was exposed for loading what would have been the Houston's 28th salvo from her main battery. The hit was a dud, but the sparks ignited the powder, causing a fire which forced the flooding of the forward magazines. 80. Now both forward turrets were silent forever. The Houston gamely returned fire, hitting the Mikuma on the bridge, killing 6 and wounding 11 Japanese. The Houston's 5-inch guns were now reduced to firing off their star shells, though the range was now so close that even the star shells were deadly to the Japanese crewmen, immolating them on deck. But it was an unequal fight. So many torpedoes appeared that there was almost no way of tracking them all. Precisely how many torpedoes hit the Houston is still unknown. Based on her reconstructed log, the general belief is at least 4. Commander Maher, the cruiser's gunnery officer, would later say, "Because of the overwhelming volume of fire and the sheer rapidity with which hits were being scored on the Houston, it is impossible to determine in many instances whether a shell, torpedo, or bomb hit had occurred." Her first hit by a torpedo, apparently from either Shirakumo or Murakumo, was on the starboard side beneath the bridge. 2 more came in quick succession, all on the starboard side. The Houston was now disemboweled, quickly taking on a 10-degree list to starboard. That was it. It has been claimed that Captain Rooks considered beaching the cruiser on the beaches of Bantam Bay, where the crew would disembark and fight on shore back to civilization, such as it was, but in any event he did not do so. Having been forced from the bridge by the fire in the No. 2 turret, Rooks summoned the Marine bugler, Jack Lee, and said to him, "Bugler, sound abandoned ship." Lee played it into the ship's PA system. One survivor marveled at Lee's composure. He never missed one beat on that bugle. It would have been absolutely beautiful if it had been anywhere else but that time. On this night, everyone on the Houston, even the bugler, was at his absolute best. The crew began abandoning ship. Motor torpedo boats were joining the Japanese destroyers in raking the Houston's decks with machine gun fire. Some of the Houston's gunners refused to leave their posts until their ammunition was exhausted and dealt punishing blows to the boats with their .50 caliber machine guns. It was a last gesture of defiance. Officers and crewmen streamed over the sides. Walter Winslow shook hands one last time with Captain Rooks, then climbed down a ladder to the deck below just in time to see a hit where he had been standing with the skipper. Rooks was hit by shrapnel in the head and upper torso. The captain staggered and fell, covered in blood, some 10 feet away from Ensign Charles D. Smith. The ensign injected Albert Rooks with 2 tubes of morphine. He died within a minute, Smith would later write. The ensign covered him with a blanket and went to report the skipper's death to the Houston's executive officer, Commander David W. Roberts, who was now in command, and navigator Commander John A. Hollowell, Jr. Sometime later, Captain Rooks's cook, R. Fong, who had come with the Houston from Shanghai, was seen cradling the skipper's lifeless form in his arms. His voice trembling with emotion, the cook, known to the crew as Buddha, repeated over and over again, "Captain die, Houston die, Buddha die too." The Houston was caught in the glare of the Japanese searchlights, burning, blackened, twisted, slowly heeling over to starboard, sinking. But a sinking American ship was not good enough for the Japanese. They wanted her sunk. So they fired one last torpedo at the already sinking Houston at point-blank range, hitting her high on the port side. Who fired it is disputed. The Houston's log indicates that it was fired by a motor torpedo boat, but a post-war examination of Japanese records suggests the torpedo was fired at 12:29 a.m. by the destroyer Shikinami. It was pointless and academic. In response to this latest insult added to her grievous injury, the Houston merely continued her roll to starboard, her bow dipping beneath the waves. Every single primary source, from her log to Walter Winslow, mentions the state of her flag, caught in the Japanese searchlights, catching a breeze and flying defiantly from her mainmast just above the water. A sudden breeze picked up the stars and stripes still Phi Romley 2 blocked on the mainmast and waved them in one last defiant gesture. Then, with a tired shudder, she vanished beneath the Java Sea. Sources do not agree on the time she disappeared forever. Some place it at 12:36 a.m., but other, mainly American, sources estimate it to have been 12:42 to 12:45 a.m., March 1st, 1942. Only 368 of the Houston's 1,061 officers and men survived the sinking. The I were now fell-oating, swimming in the Java Sea, some trying to make it to shore, others just trying to avoid the Japanese troops searching for them, shooting some of the survivors in the water, knocking others out with hits from rowboat paddles. A total of 102 of the Houston's survivors died in POW camps. One more individual was in the water, General Inamura. After being thrown from his flagship when it was sunk by friendly fire, he spent 20 minutes on a piece of wood before being picked up by a boat, then 3 hours making his way to the beaches of Bantam Bay. Once back on terra firma, he sat down on a pile of bamboo, wet, black with oil, and exhausted. His arrogant aide, also a dripping wet, oil-covered survivor from the Ryujo Maru, and perhaps a bit chastened now, came up to him with a touch of the humour that is always needed in a war. "Congratulations," he said, "on the successful landing.